Welcome back. We're not going to sing it, even for an additional cost here. It's been a few weeks over here. It's been very busy in the Holy Apple here with these training exercises, so we've been on a little bit of a surprised vacation. Today we are on the 27th day of Adar 5778, Holy Apple, Holy Time, and we are on the second part. I hope to connect the links. This is the second part on different channels. That's why I hope to connect the two links together. This is part number 2. It's called Frightening Similarities of the Egyptian and American Exile. Frightening similarities between the American and Egyptian exiles. In the first class, we're going to give about a 2-minute summary with God's help. So those that didn't catch the first part will get a quick summary. Most of us do not know a lot about what was happening in Jewish Egyptian life. Most of us are very ignorant of the details of what was going on. We know a few things. Most of us know a few things. Number one, we know that there were 3 or 4 items that, 3 or 4 good traits that the Jewish people had that enabled them to be redeemed. That was they dressed a certain way, they continued to dress a certain way, they spoke the Hebrew language, bless you, they spoke the Hebrew language, and they did not change their names to protect the innocent or not to protect the innocent, and according to some opinion, they did not mingle or assimilate, intermarry with the Egyptian women or men. So those were the good things that they had. We also know another bad thing. They were on the 49th level of impurity when they were redeemed from the land of Egypt. Not such a high level, to say the least. At the beginning, the Jewish people lived in a secluded area of Egypt only for Jews. It was called Goshen. It was acquired a few hundred years before Jacob enters Egypt by a gift given by Pharaoh after he kidnapped Sarah from Abraham, and this was some kind of compensation to Abraham and to Sarah. He gave over the rights to the city of Goshen. Jewish people are redeemed. Question is, was everybody on the same wave? Was everybody in the same basket? Can we put all our eggs in one basket? Or were there different, perhaps, groups that existed in Egypt? Okay, now, today, we're still on our summary of our first class, but we started to take a new look at life in Egypt for the Jewish people. Now, assimilation did not happen in one shot. Usually it doesn't. It's a process. And it was a process, it was a 3-step process for the Jewish people. Number 1, when Jacob passed away, there was a downhill mode for the Jewish people. There was a certain level of assimilation that occurred. Second hit the Jewish people took was when Joseph passed away. That brought us further down to impurity. Third hit was when all the representatives of the 12 tribes, when they passed away. The last one to pass away, of course, was Levi. He lived the longest life, and when he passed away, the last of the 12 tribes, things got pretty bad. As far as servitude in Egypt, there was different periods of time. When things started getting real bad, we're talking about 116 years before redemption. When things got even worse, we're talking about 86 years before redemption. So there are different stations, one might say, that the Jewish people were in one of these downhill spirals. The Kli Yakar claims that the beginning of the downfall of the Jewish people was when the Jewish people began to look at their life in Egypt as not something which is temporarily. They looked at it as something permanent. They looked at themselves as equal citizens. This was they bought property. Once they looked at themselves as equal to the Egyptians, according to the Kli Yakar, this was the beginning of the downfall of the Jewish people. We spoke about, our last class, we spoke about that the Jewish people, after Joseph passed away, many of them stopped performing the commandment of circumcision. They did not want to look different than the Egyptian people. Number 3, Jews started going with haircuts similar to the Gentiles in Egypt. Number 4, the Jewish people started to fill the stadiums, culture activities in Egypt. They began to become involved. Just on our level, I've heard rumors. I'm not a big Yankee fan or a New York fan at all, but some rumor has it that you could even get kosher food in Yankee Stadium or Met Stadium. Don't know. But anyways, this is something that's not new, if that is so. So this began, Jewish people began attending cultural events of the Egyptian people. And last but not least, we spoke about the Jews began to move out of the secluded Jewish-only community of Goshen and began to live within, amongst the Egyptians. So all these ingredients together spelled bad news for them Jews. That's where we got up to. So now we're all caught up. Okay, this week, with God's help, put on a seatbelt because this class is, really thank Hashem for sending me this class, because it's really an eye-opener. And right now we're about 17 days before the holiday of Passover, so it's useful to come this year. You know, we say, what's the difference between this night and all other nights? We could say, God willing, this year, when we come to the night of the Seder. I know that one of my daughters once came up to me about 3 years ago and said, you know, we go through the words of the book of Passover, which is called the Haggadah, but we don't really know what was going on behind the scenes. How was it for the Jews living in Egypt? We don't really know about that. And that got me thinking about how was it? How did the Jews really manage in Egypt? And what was this assimilation process? And is there anything similar in our times? And as we will see, as we've seen so far also, it's very, very shocking the similarities that we have between Egypt and also America today within the Jewish community. Okay, so put on those seatbelts. We're off here. The Jewish people, of course, they were slaves, but they were not all slaves. There were many, many groups of Jews. For example, one that's more publicized is the fact that the tribe of Levi was never enslaved in Egypt. They were not slaves in Egypt. They didn't go through the whole process. In fact, that's one of the reasons, according to many commentators, they were so small, because they didn't pay the price. And if you don't pay the price, you don't get the benefits of this tremendous blessing that the Jewish people received as far as multiplying. Jewish people multiplied. There were a regular birth would be 6 kids in one shot. So they were not. They were the smallest tribe around because they were not subjugated to slavery in Egypt. But there were other groups, not just Levi, as we will see. Unbelievable. What we thought growing up as kids, or maybe seeing movies about it, maybe the Ten Commandments, all the Jews were slaves. Not so whatsoever. We will see very interesting Jews that existed at that time who were very far away from being slaves. Okay, so our first source today, we're in the Tosfot, Balei Tosfot. We're in the portion of the week of Va'era, of Shmot. We're on page 16 and 17. Listen closely. We know that the Egyptians were afraid of some kind of coup against their regime. So who exactly were they afraid the Jews were going to join forces with? So we have here our first Tosfot. He explains something very interesting, that in the land of Israel, the Canaanites lived at the time that the Jewish people were in Egypt. Canaanites lived there. And the Canaanites were subjugated to paying taxes to who? To the Egyptians. So they, the Canaanite population, they were not exactly thrilled too much with the Egyptian people because they were being heavily taxed by the Egyptian people. So they were looking for some kind of partner to revolt. Who was this partner? Possibility was the Egyptians understood well. The possibility would be that the Jewish people would join forces with the Canaanite people and try to revolt against Egypt. Why? Because the Tosfot says an unbelievable Torah, that during the time that the Jews are enslaved in Egypt, there were many Jews who had property, housing property. They had lots. They had, it's not lox and bagels, lots. Like places, stores. They had fields. And they would send out various representatives of theirs. Jews would go out of Egypt, unbelievable. It says that there were no slaves that escaped from Egypt. That's true. But these people were not slaves. There were many Jews that were not slaves. So they left freely Egypt. They had all this wealth. Amazing concept. They had all this wealth. It's sometimes when you listen to business people, they will tell you that there's some kind of collapse that's on its way, but you can actually make money off the collapse. Now, to me, that blows me away, because if there's a collapse, so everybody goes down. Not so. So there are certain people which are at the top of their fields. They are able to take advantage of the collapse, and they know exactly what to invest at the time of the collapse that they see coming, the economic collapse. They're able to take advantage of that and make money actually off of it. Make money while everybody is suffering, or the majority of people are suffering, but there's a certain amount of percentage of the population that take advantage of the situation. That's how it is today. That's how it was in the First and Second World War. And that's how it was in Egypt. There were Jews that, though the Jewish people as a whole were enslaved, there was a certain percentage of them were not. So the Egyptians were afraid. They saw the power, the wealth, the clout that the Jews were holding, and they knew that the Canaanite population was very, very upset that they were being heavily taxed. So they, understandably, they were afraid that the Jewish people and the Canaanites would join together to revolt against the Egyptian people. Now this is an important point, because most of us, when it comes to the time of Egypt and and Passover time, we have such a childish view of what was going on. What basically we understand is things that we were taught when we were 3, 4, 5 years old, and that's what we retain, and that's what we continue. We're on the same stupid level that we were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, however old we might be. And it's important to understand that life is life. The way that God rolls the ball in life, it's not like all of a sudden, oh my God, these Egyptians, where did they come up with this idea? It's not the Egyptians, wow, where did they come up with this idea? It's a miracle that they enslaved the Jewish people. No, it wasn't a miracle. There are things that happen on the ground, facts on the ground. And the Egyptians, like many, many other exiles, became afraid of the power, political power, the wealth, the clout that the Jewish people had. They were afraid. And therefore, they took measures in order to defend themselves. Of course, they exaggerated. They went overboard. And that's for sure. But let's look at life as it really is. Let's live in the reality. The Egyptians didn't all of a sudden come out of nowhere with these decrees against the Jewish people. As time developed, as the Jewish people gained more strength, power, and influence in Egypt, therefore the fear of the Egyptian people and the Egyptian ruling class became greater, and in turn there were decrees against the Jewish people. It says in the beginning of the Torah, that in the beginning of the book of Exodus, it says that the Jewish people were taxed at the beginning. Can you believe this? One of the taxes was, according to the Tosfot, on page 17 here, Shmot, he writes an unbelievable tax. There was a tax that any Jew that had children would be taxed. What was the idea? The idea was that the Egyptians were afraid that the Jewish people were becoming so many in population, were growing such population growth, that they would soon take over Egypt. They would run Egypt. So they were afraid. So what did they do? They taxed any Jew that would have a baby would be taxed. And this is an amazing thing, because those living in Israel, we all know, when I had my first kids, we received a lot of money each month from the national insurance of Israel for each kid. Now, it's a joke. Now they give you like 50 shekel, 60 shekel. Am I right, Arya? It's about 60 shekel a kid.
It's more. It's 100 and something.
100. But I'm talking about when I first got, it was hundreds of shekels for each kid. So why did they all of a sudden take away this benefit? Because they are afraid. The establishment of Israel is afraid that who has kids? The religious people have kids. And they were afraid that because they didn't want to give incentive to the religious people to have kids, so they made it much harder to have kids. So this is an amazing concept. So here, Israel, okay, in Israel 5778, 2018, we have very similar tactics that were established in Egypt. When I was in prison, they notified us one day that we would have to work. Instead of being able to learn, we would have to work. So there were a few people that refused to go out and work. I was one person that refused to work, said I'm only going to study. And it's a long story. I'm not going to go into it right now. There was a very, very, very special Jew that really saved me. A worker of the prison saved me, but I'm not going to go into the whole story how he did it. But I was interviewed. I was taken out of this solitary confinement, and I was brought to the chief of staff of the prison system, the head of the prison system. And he says, you know, why don't you work? I said, let me tell you something. You're worse than Pharaoh. What? He says to me, I'm worse than Pharaoh? I said, yeah, I'll tell you why. Because Pharaoh respected the tribe of the Levites, Levi, and he did not enslave the tribe of Levi because he understood that they were a special tribe that dedicated their life and their time to learning of Torah, to spirituality. So he allowed them not to be enslaved. And you are worse. There are people that want to work, people that want to learn in this prison, and you are putting us in solitary confinement. You are punishing us. Yes, you are worse than Pharaoh. So it's very interesting how sometimes in Israel, modern day, we see similar lines that existed in Egypt. Similar types of thinking that were in Egypt. Okay. Another opinion of the Tosfot, it says that the Jewish people will go up from Egypt. What does that mean, go up to Egypt? The Baal Tosfot says, he says it goes up to the land of Israel, because the land of Israel is considered to be the highest spiritual place. So it's considered to be going up. You go up to Israel. So they were afraid that the Jewish people, who were becoming very, very strong in Egypt and very influential in Egypt, they were afraid that they would go back to their birthplace. This is very interesting because we have to understand that there were many, many Jews already that were not born. Their birthplace was not the land of Israel. We're talking about Jacob came 210 years before the redemption, and this period of time that we're working with right now, we're talking about 100 or 110 years later. So we have a lot of people out there, we have a few generations here that were not born in the land of Israel at all. But this is an important Tosfot here. Tosfot explains to us that a Jew, no matter where you are in the world, you have to look at yourself as, you know what? My birthplace is the land of Israel. Even though physically we were not born, we are really all from the land of Israel. And this is written clearly that in the Zohar HaKadosh. The Zohar HaKadosh writes that every Jewish soul is from the land of Israel. So they were afraid. They understood that the connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. Now this is very, very important because it's written again in a different place on the Tosfot. It says the following, that they were worried that the Jewish people would return to the land of their forefathers, and this would not be good for the Egyptian people. So why is this important? Why is this important? It's extremely important. Because today we have something called dual citizenship, and we have some question that we hear many, many times. If there would be a war between Israel and America, whose side would you take? Right? Dual loyalship. Who are you going to take sides with? Are you going to take sides with the Jews? Or are you going to take sides with the Americans? Now this is something that bothers a lot of people, because many Jews will say that they, rightfully so, they'll say we're on the side of the Jewish people. If America goes out and fights, we're on the side of the Jewish people. People do not like to hear that. If you're living in their country, they want to believe that you're loyal citizens. And this theoretical question to them is a big thorn in their side. And this is exactly what was happening in Egypt. The same thing that's going on today. The same fear that the Egyptians had, that the Jewish people would give their loyalty over to the land of Israel over Egypt, or joining forces with the Canaanites who were in the land of Israel. This dual loyalty, they feared that the Jewish people were not loyal to Egypt, and they had all kinds of plans that they were interested in leaving and going back to the land of Israel and revolting against them. So this is a troublesome issue for the Jewish people. Okay, let's take another look. This time from the commentator, the Meshech Chochma, Rav Meir Simcha. He writes in his commentary on Torah, in the portion of Va'era, it's 6:9. An amazing statement. Listen to this. And he was not the one that originally wrote this. This could be found, what we're going to go into right now, this can be found originally in the Talmud Yerushalmi, the tractate Rosh Hashanah. It's on the 3rd chapter, the 5th law. The third chapter, 5th law. This is brought down by one of the commentators on the Talmud called the Korban Ha'ida, who lived approximately 500 or so years ago. So let's take it though from Meshech Chochma. And here's what he writes. It's an amazing thing. It says that when Moses comes to the Jewish people for the first time, they were not willing to listen to them, to Moses and Aaron. They were not willing to listen to them. And it says something that Moses commanded them to do something, but it doesn't say black and white. What was the commandment? So the Talmud Yerushalmi that I mentioned says, what was the commandment? The commandment was to free slaves. Now, it doesn't say which period of history are we talking about. Are we talking about once we come to the land of Israel? Are we talking about in the Jubilee year? It's not clear from the Talmud Yerushalmi in Rosh Hashanah. What exactly is the time frame that, what is Moses telling the Jewish people today? Okay, this is a year or so before the Jewish people are redeemed. What in the world is he telling them? It's so important that Moses comes to the Jewish people. Listen, I got to command you guys to let the slaves go. Moses, wait, hold on, hold your horses here. This is a commandment that maybe will come into play in years from now. Let's talk about basics here. Why is Moses telling the people about freeing slaves? Commandment to free slaves. Wait a year, 2 years, maybe 40 years we need to wait. Maybe more than that, 100 years. Not now. So the Meshech Chochma says an unbelievable Torah, folks. Listen to this closely. Unbelievable. He says the following, that it's possible to give the following answer. That amongst the Jewish people, there were many people that were statesmen, people that had political clout, Jews that had positions in the government. And they themselves utilized their power and they had Jewish slaves. Amazing! We're thinking about, hey, Passover, we got out of slavery. Oh, thank God, I had my Jewish boss. We don't think in those terms. The Rav Meir Simcha, unbelievable, tremendous line. And once again, this is understood by the commentator, the Korban Aida, on the Jerusalem Talmud. And he says, what tribes were these diplomats and these important figures? What tribes were they from, or tribe? And he says that it's possible to say that they were from 3 tribes. 3! Amazing! 3 out of 12 tribes. Reuven, Shimon, and Levi. These 3 tribes had Jewish slaves. So therefore Moses, when he meets up with the Jewish people, after returning, after a 60-year break, we thought that we had a couple weeks here, we didn't have a class. Think about that break. That was some kind of break, Moses. So after 60 years, Moses is back in Egypt, and he comes to the Jewish people to tell them that they're about to be redeemed. But first, time out, Moses has to tell them to free slaves. And we said at first, what's he talking about, Moses? It's something in the future. It's not necessary right now for us to know to free slaves. Right now, we are the slaves. No, according to these opinions, the Jewish people, in order for God to release us, you can't be a hypocrite. If the Jewish people are enslaving Jews, fellow Jews, there is no exodus from Egypt. First you have to be straight, you have to be honest, can't be a hypocrite. So this is an amazing thing. So the Jewish people, 3 tribes who had positions of power in Egypt, in the government, or in the municipality. 3 tribes, Reuben, Shimon, and Levi, they had Jewish slaves. And there's no exodus from Egypt until you release those slaves. That's what was happening. Amazing. Next source, this is brought down by Rav Sternbach in his book, Tam Vedat, page 56. He says the following, that we know that 80% of the Jewish people remained in Egypt and were killed during the 3 days of darkness, the plague of 3 days of darkness. Who were these people? According to Rav Sternbach in his commentary, an amazing thing. These Jews were well-to-do, were wealthy Jews. They were Jews who had tremendous power and respect from the Egyptian people. Amazing thing. Something we would never think in a million years. If someone would tell us those slaves in Egypt, you know, they were powerful Jews, and there were Jews within the government and in the municipalities, in the city hall, we wouldn't believe it. These were people that were exempt from slavery. They were exempt from taxes. And these wicked people, these were the 80% that stayed back. It's an amazing thing. Think about that. It's according to this opinion, the majority of the Jewish people, 80%, were not slaves. Folks, if you're still sitting down, you must have smoked something last night, pretty seriously. Amazing Torah. Really an amazing thing. These 80%, who the majority of the Jewish people who carried a lot of clout, a lot of power, and they were exempt from slavery and from taxes in Egypt. Going on further. Listen to this. This is in Glilei Zahav, Commentary on the Torah, page 55 in the book of Exodus. The Glilei Zahav, Rav David Moshkovitz, says tells us unbelievable situation. How was life for the Jews, for many Jews in Egypt? It wasn't so bad. Here's what he writes. The Jewish people in Egypt, we're talking about the beginning. The Jewish people in Egypt, they multiplied in amazing amounts. Not only did they multiply in numbers, but it means when the Torah says they multiply, we're talking about monetarily wise, we're talking about respect, we're talking about positions. And therefore, the Egyptians were very, very frightened from the Jewish people, because the Jewish people were beginning to fill all positions, all occupations in Egypt. And he says, what does that mean? It means that they began to buy out businesses. They began to buy out factory areas. They ruled the business class of Egypt. Everything was in Jewish hands. Not only that, the Egyptians would rent homes from the Jewish people. The Jewish people were those landlords. Sound familiar? I mean, this is an amazing thing. This is what's going on today. This is what many people feel deep down in their heart. Many people might be shy to say it. But many people, when they look around, they feel that the Jewish people control. They control the government. They control the Democratic Party. They control Congress. They control the president. They control Hollywood. And the list and the beat goes on and on and on. This is something that is frightening. This is something that's happening today. It happened then. It has happened throughout history. And it's happening again today. And this is a wake-up call for all of us. The Glilei Zahav he goes on and says the following, that there were basically two populations amongst the Jewish people, two classes of Jews. Some that became very, very poor, lost it all. These were people, because of their desperate situation and they became slaves, they stuck together. These were the people that left Egypt. However, there was a different class, there was a different population who were extremely well-to-do, carried a lot of clout, had a lot of influence in Egypt, and were running around during the time that the Jews were enslaved. These were the people, according to Rabbi Moshkovitz, these were the people that stayed back. These were the people that were not redeemed from Egypt. So it's an amazing thing. Two different types of populations that developed within the Jewish Egyptian community. And last but not least, this is an amazing line. I mean, every time I look at it again, I have to like rub my eyes to make sure that I'm seeing it. But listen to this closely. Listen to this very closely. We just came off of Purim. Is there a connection between Purim and Pesach? Of course there is. The Talmud says that when we enter the month of Adar, we have to start rejoicing. Our level of rejoicing must go up. Now, Rashi brings down, this is not just in the month of Adar, but it's also in the month of Nisan. So there's a connection between Purim and Pesach. We have to continue this high level of celebration and happiness. Just like in the month of Purim, also in the month of Passover. But listen to what he says. Why did God have to send Haman? Why was there a need? Listen to what he says, an amazing thing. He says because the Jews in Persia, in 127 provinces that Achashverosh, the king Achashverosh ruled over, where Jews lived, they did not want to leave to go back to the land of Israel. So Hashem, God, had to send an evil king like the likes of Haman in order to scare the blank out of the Jewish people. For what? In order to get them back to the land of Israel, to understand that they're not in their home, to understand that they're in danger. Just like this happened once, it will happen again. Where do we see this? Mordechai, after the danger is over, what does he do? He remains in the government of Persia. Why does he remain? The fact is that because of the fact that he remained in the government, many of the outstanding sages of Mordechai's time left him, which means that they were upset with Mordechai because of the fact that the danger is now over and Mordechai should get back to the the yeshiva studies, go back to the Torah learning. But Mordechai understood that there is a danger that this will happen once again, and we need people, we need somebody over here till we get to the land of Israel, till we get the masses out of here. There has to be somebody on the inside that could save the day. So that's an amazing thing. We don't think about Purim as, oh, God sent Haman because Jews did not want to go back to the land of Israel. We don't think of that holiday in those concepts. And then to boot that, this is the grand slam here of the Glilei Zahav. This is the grand slam. He writes that the same is true. Why did God turn a positive situation that the Jews had when they were in Egypt? They were doing very well. Why did God turn the experience into a nightmare? Why did they all of a sudden become slaves? Why did the Egyptians who loved the Jewish people, why did their love all of a sudden turn into hate? You know why? Because they didn't want to go to the land of Israel. That's what he writes here. An amazing thing. Whoever would think in their right mind that the reason why God made things so bad for the Jewish people is because that they do not want to leave the land of Egypt. Well, it's a fact. Because 80% did not leave the land of Egypt. So when God sent this evil Pharaoh to make things worse for the Jewish people, thank God he was able to save 20% of the Jewish people. But 80%, 80%, they did not want to leave at even the cost of their life. Amazing stuff. Another interesting phenomena, Jewish life in Egypt back 3,400 years ago. There's a very unbelievable question which unfortunately myself, maybe others, didn't think about. Moses, one morning, he goes and he sees that an Egyptian is beating up on a Jew, and he steps in and he kills the Egyptian and he buries him. According to what we understand, that Moses looks to the right, to the left, to make sure that nobody is, no cameras, no CNN, no Fox on scene over there, and then he kills the Egyptian. The next day, Moses comes back and he sees two Jews fighting amongst themselves, and he tries to calm them down. And then these two Jews that are fighting, their names were Datan and Aviram, and they say, "Hey, Moses, are you trying to kill us like you killed that Egyptian yesterday?" Whoa! Like Moses thought that he was scot-free, right? Nobody saw it. So the question is that we never asked, God Almighty, why didn't Moses blow those two guys away? Why didn't Moses kill Datan and Aviram? There's a Jewish law that if a person, a group of people, doesn't matter, are about to slander and go to the government, or go to the authorities, to the police, with information to turn over Jews which will endanger Jewish property or Jewish life, there is a Jewish law that you are allowed to slay them before they go and brief the authorities. So what in the world is happening here? Why didn't Moses just blow these two guys away? And there's a word, 3 words. Achen noda davar. Moses says, oh my God, it's known. What does that mean, it's known? Folks, you have to open up your heart for this. According to the Sforno on Exodus chapter 2, verse 14, an amazing thing. He asked this question, why didn't Moses blow away these two evil Jews that are going to go to the authorities, the Egyptian authorities, and tell what Moses did to this Egyptian, and Moses' life is in danger now. He should have slain them. And the Sforno says an unbelievable answer. That at the time of the fight, this argument and dispute that was taking place between these two evil Jews, Datan and Aviram, there were multitudes of people that were around. There were multiple people, there were multitudes of Jews that were around as this was happening. And Moses realized that what good is it going to be if I slain either Datan or Aviram? Moses looked out and he saw that there's a large amount of population here, Jewish population, that know what happened. They were told by Datan and Aviram what happened. And Moses knew that even if he slain Datan and Aviram, there would be other Jews that, can you believe this? There would be other lowlifes, Jews, that would go and think on Moses to the authorities. So there was no benefit for Moses to kill 2 people. If you're in trouble by hundreds of people, by killing 2 people, you haven't helped yourself out at all. So Moses knew that he had to get away. Moses had to run away. But that's an amazing thing. Moses was afraid that because of the fact that a large amount of Jews now knew about what he had done, they too, if not for Datan and Aviram, others would go to the authorities to relay what had happened. This is written in black and white. It says in Midrash HaGadol, portion of Bo, the book of Exodus, on chapter 10, verse 23. It says the following. Why did God, it's asked a question, why did God bring upon the Egyptians the plague of darkness? And the answer is because of the fact that God wanted to eliminate the wicked Jews that lived at the time in Egypt, and He did not want there to be a tremendous desecration of God's name by the fact that they would see that the Jews were dying out. So God turned off the lights, so to speak, and none of the Egyptians knew what was happening. Only the Jews, who was light for them, they knew what was happening. And at this time, during this week, 80% of the Jewish people were wiped out. These were people, according to the Midrash HaGadol, this source of ours, listen to this, these were people that did not believe in redemption. They did not believe that the Jewish people would be redeemed, and they were people that went and slandered the other Jews to the Egyptian people. Says it black and white. It's an amazing thing that at the time of the Egyptian exile, there were many, many, many Jews who were collaborators with the Egyptians. And they went and they gave over information on what was happening with the Jewish slave population. Collaborators. It is not new. It is not from the Holocaust. It is in every generation that there are collaborators. Till this very second when we stand here in Tapuach, there are collaborators who are looking to turn over good, selfless Jews to the authorities. That's what was happening. And therefore, Moses did not have any reason to kill Datan and Aviram because it was a problem. According to Moses, this was a national problem of the Jewish people. It was not something local. It wasn't a local problem. It wasn't these two exceptions to the rules. It was a national plague of Jewish collaborators with the Egyptians, turning their brothers over to the authorities. Amazing. What else do we know about the Jewish people at the time? According to the prophet Yechezkel, Yechezkel writes in chapter 20, verses 7 and 8, he talks about the fact that God sends Moses and Aaron to the Jewish people and tells them to leave idol worshipping. The Jewish people had over the years in Egypt, living amongst the Egyptians who were deep in idol worshipping, they became influenced by the majority population and they too began to worship idols. So therefore, God sends Moses and Aaron down to the Jewish people, and one of the first things that they request of the Jewish people is to leave their idolatry. But the prophet Ezekiel, he says that they did not listen. The Jewish people did not listen to Moses. They continued worshiping idols. Now this went on for some time, and only at the Moses comes and tells the Jewish people, listen, you're about to be redeemed. Now this is a tremendous good news, right? We've been slaves for 116 or 86 years, different opinions. But we've been slaves for many, many years, and one day is enough. 86 years, 116, it's all bad news. So it says that the Jewish people did not listen. We are in the portion of Va'era, chapter 6, verses 4 and 5. And it says they did not listen to Jewish people. So our sages ask a question. How could it be that Moses has come to give them this tremendous tiding, this good tiding, this tremendous news, and the Jewish people are not listening to him? V'lo shamu el Moshe mikotzer ruach? They did not have any patience to listen to this? What are you talking about? He's telling you, he's giving you the ticket out. We're out of here. And it says, why did they not want to listen to Moses? Because they did not want to leave their idol worshipping. Amazing thing. Imagine, Moses comes to the Jewish people, we're getting out of here, let my people go. And the people say, we ain't going anywhere. We just ain't going to go. Why aren't you going? Well, you know, we have all our idol worshipping here in Egypt, and we're accustomed to it. We just don't want to, we don't want to leave it. Now we understand why. Before the Jewish people, before God redeemed the Jewish people, they had to take the idol of the Egyptian people, which was the sheep. They had to take the idol of the Egyptian people and slaughter it and put the blood in everyone's face on their doorpost, visible for all the Egyptian people. They took it 4 days before the redemption, so the Egyptians would ask the Jewish people, what are you doing with all these sheep? What do you do with all these sheep? And the Jewish people would say, well, in a couple of days, we're going to slaughter them. What? This is our God. It's like taking the Quran and burning it. Imagine doing that today. You'd be under fire. So this was a tremendous tikkun, fixing for the Jewish people. They were so deeply steeped in idol worshiping that when first Moses came a year ago, they did not want to listen to his message of freedom because of the fact they were so steeped in idol worshipping. In fact, this I just saw yesterday, an amazing thing. I saw this yesterday, that even though the Jewish people did a tremendous act of sacrifice, they endangered their lives by taking the idol, which was the sheep of the Egyptian people, and slaughtering it in front of their face. They endangered their lives. They took a tremendous risk. They really were not 100% or 90% even clean of idol worshipping. You know how sometimes a person goes on a diet and they're able for a couple of days, maybe a week, 2, they're able to keep up with it. But they go back. They're not out of the woods yet. They're still in deep water. They're still in deep trouble. This is exactly what happened. If you look at the words, when the Jewish people arrive at the Red Sea, at the sea, what do they say to Moses? An amazing statement. I never realized this till yesterday. It says in the Torah that they told Moses it would have been better if we would have continued to work, continue to worship the Egyptians, or to be subservient to the Egyptians. La'avod. What does that mean? So I saw yesterday an amazing commentary. What does it mean? It means that at that moment, they see the Egyptians coming from behind. They see the sea in front of them. They're saying, you know what? We made a bad mistake. Because our idol worshipping, those Egyptians, they're on the horse, and we're stuck here. We're about to die, and the Egyptians are going to be victorious. You know why the Egyptians are going to be victorious? Because of their idol worshipping. So they said it would have been better, Moses, if we stayed in Egypt to be subservient to the Egyptians, which means to be subservient to their idols. And we know that there is a difference between a Jew and a non-Jew as far as if a Jew thinks about performing a transgression but does not do it, he does not receive, or she does not receive, any credit as if they did it. On the other hand, there is one exception for a Jew. If a Jew thinks about some concept of idol worshipping, even though they do not physically idol worship, it's as if they idol worshipped. Amazing thing. So, therefore, now we understand when the Jewish people have their backs against the wall, the Egyptians are coming fast, and we got the sea in front of our face. There's nowhere out here. There's no escape. So the spiritual angels in heaven of Egypt came to God and said, why are you going to drown our people, the Egyptians? The Jews are as bad as the Egyptians. Why? Because they, just as the Egyptians worship idols, the Jews worship idols. Now here's the catch. I don't understand. Why didn't God answer very simply? That was then. Hey, don't you know, like fast forward, that was, that was a while ago, but didn't you see the movie? 10 Plagues or the 10 Commandments? Did you see that? Before they left Egypt, they took their idols, they slaughtered them, they're clean. That's not the answer of God. Because they were not clean. They still had a thought, they've been redeemed out of Egypt, and they're sitting between the Egyptians and the sea and the water. They said it would have been better if we would have continued being subservient to the Egyptians, which means continued our idol worshipping. We see that the Egyptians are going to be victorious here over our so-called God. They are going to be victorious. Their God defeats our God. So that's why it was a problem. There was a problem at this time. You can't just give an answer that the Jewish people are no longer there, they've repented, because not so. It was not so. Okay. It is prevalent amongst the Jewish population to say, there are sources, of course, to this, that according to most of our understanding, the Jewish people had one thing going for them in Egypt, a few things, as we mentioned, but one thing we're going to discuss right now was that they did not assimilate, they did not intermarry with the Egyptians. Is this the understanding all across the board amongst all sources, commentators, or was there assimilation happening amongst the Jewish people? Were there Jews marrying out of the faith? This is the question. Okay, so once again, it's common to understand there are sources. We're not going to go into them because they're known that the Jewish people did not intermarry with the Egyptians. That was one of their pluses. But it's not across the board. Listen to this. Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, we're on the 48th chapter. The 48th chapter says the following. Rabbi Yehuda writes that there were three good qualities of the Jewish people that enabled them to be redeemed. What were they? Number one, they did not change their language. They continued to speak the Jewish language, Hebrew. Number two, there was no gossiping or evil speech amongst themselves. And number three, they did not change their names. According to Rav Yehuda, three good traits. This is very interesting because according to most sources there were four. And the fourth happens to be that the Jewish people did not intermarry with the Egyptians. Rabbi Yehuda does not include this. Very interesting. Okay. We go to further down the line and we see, that was Rabbi Yehuda. Let's look at Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi writes, listen to this, that the Egyptians were polluting, were defiling the Jewish women in Egypt. Amazing. Never heard before almost. How many times have you heard that one? Almost never. According to Rabbi Yossi, the Egyptians defiled Jewish women. Now, the commentator, the Marzu, Rabbi Eliezer Einhorn, he says an amazing thing. He picks up on this. He says it is possible that Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi, in this source of Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, the 48th chapter, they both have the same exact opinion. What is the opinion? That there was that there was assimilation going on between the Jewish males and females and the Egyptian males and females. According to this, there is two sages of ours that claim that this was happening, and they are not alone. Why? The Zohar Kadosh writes specifically in the portion of the week of Truma, in the book of Exodus, portion Truma, on page 170, side B, the Zohar Kadosh says the following. He says that when the Jewish people were up against the wall and they were at the Dead Sea and the Egyptians were chasing them, God was about to drown the Egyptians, and then spiritual forces, angels, came to God and said, this is not fair. Why? Because just like the Egyptians worship idols, the Jewish people also worshipped idols, as we spoke about 5 minutes ago. But they go on further. These spiritual forces in the world said the following, that just like the Egyptians have illegal sexual behavior, relations, so too with the Jewish people. So too with the Jewish people. Now, it is true that according to the Ramak, Rav Moshe Cordovero, in his book, he eliminates this line. Why? Because it's problematic. Because we've said that the saving force of the Jewish people during the Egyptian exile was the fact that they kept their modesty. They kept away from relations with the Egyptian men or females. And here we see sources so far. We saw Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi in Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. Now we see this straight out from the Zohar Kadosh. This is also in the book Yalkut Ruveni on the portion of Bishalach, page 71. So we have a lot of sources here that are going down. A possible, and we'll stop at this, a possible solution to this contradiction, okay? Very big contradiction here. Were the Jewish people assimilating sexually? Were they having relations? Were they marrying? On one hand, we see that this is a saving quality of the Jewish people. That's why they were redeemed. On the other hand, we see all of a sudden a different view, that it was not so. So I found this in a book called Ateret Yoshua. Ateret Yoshua, written by Rabbi Moshe Aryeh Friend, and in his commentary on the Torah, on the portion of Bishalach, page 82, he says the following. Maybe we can reconcile these opinions the following. That the Jewish people physically did not have relations, sexual relations with the Egyptian population. However, they thought about, they entertained these ideas many times. And because of the fact that they entertained these ideas, it's as if they had relations with the Egyptian population. So that's a possibility. As a fact, they did not. But in their minds, which are, as we know in Judaism, the most holy part of a person, the most precious part of a Jew, of course, is one's mind. Much greater than a person's limbs and body, but a person's mind. The slightest, also health-wise, if a person has some kind of slight, something go wrong in their mind, you're finished. So, in the Jewish mind, they entertained these thoughts of relations, these illicit relations, illegal relations, that they entertained it many, many times in their thoughts. So therefore, it's as if they did the actual sinning. God willing, next week we will be back for part 3, and we will take another look at the 80% that did not leave Egypt, and we will see if there are any similarities to the Jewish people today in the American exile and other places.